how are we ourselves growing and engaging in society? Who are we allies for? How does that play out in our own lives? And how do we bring that to the classroom? Thinking about that for ourselves as educators, and then also thinking about how can we create experiences where our students can unpack those elements of their identity and their experiences in the same way.
Hi, I'm Nora Jones. Welcome to It's About Language. This podcast connects language and culture to life, learning, and hope. You'll experience insightful conversations with creative leaders in the fields of education, business, arts, and science. My guests shed light on the impact of language and culture on individuals and society as they share their stories and experiences. You'll be informed and inspired as we explore how language and culture make us human and bring hope in the midst of a challenging world. And so it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. L.J. Randolph, Jr., Education Doctor, Associate Professor of Spanish and Education, and coordinator of World Language Teacher Education Program at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington. And I'm doing that introduction because there are so many things, LJ, in your background with regard to teacher training and teaching courses in Spanish and participating in organizations. And we are recording this podcast on January 7th, the day after the chaos and insurrection at the nation's capital. And so it's a great honor and pleasure to welcome you this day, and it's very timely for our topic today.
Yes. And thank you, Nora, for this opportunity, and very happy to be here and to chat with you today about thinking about how we can incorporate social justice oriented pedagogies in the language classroom, and what place the language classroom has in the context of critical pedagogy.
Absolutely. And I've been writing lately about on the website about the fact that language and culture is part of our identity. And
Hmm.
when we were talking here, you were mentioning about what the potential approach of some educators are in classrooms. I mean, K-12, university, etc., on the day after such an important historical and challenging event for our society. And what tell our listeners some of the things that were on your mind about how people might be responding and some of your thoughts about their approaches to either addressing or not what happened yesterday.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have so many complex thoughts about this. This is something that
Hmm.
I remember yesterday when it happened, and I wasn't watching on the television. I was just kind of scrolling through Twitter, and just my whole world stopped. All productivity. I have classes coming up, other projects that I'm trying to work on, and
Hmm.
all of that stopped for the rest of the day, really. And was looking at social media and some of the teachers with whom I engage on social media, and a question that was on a lot of people's minds was, what do I do tomorrow? Right?
Uh-huh.
How do I address this in the classroom? I don't even know where to start. And we've had conversations previously, you and I, about this idea of, I think we like things to be neat, and that's not the way society works. That's not the way people work, and I think that's a great quality, right? We're complex individuals. We come to the classroom. We have our own experiences, our own perspectives. We can go back to linking this to the language curriculum. We all have our own practices, products, and perspectives, right?
Yes,
The three
indeed.
P's. From our own cultures and intersections of various identities that we bring to the classroom. And when we think about something as polemic as what happened in Washington yesterday, and really what's been happening for several years. Um, it it becomes difficult to think about how am I going to address this in the classroom? What role do I have as the teacher with regard to addressing these issues? And so I found that a lot of teachers were thinking, I want to do something. I feel this onus to incorporate this into the classroom, to welcome this conversation into the classroom, to welcome this opportunity for transformative learning in the classroom.
Hmm.
Um, but I'm not exactly sure how to do it. And I saw a range of responses. There were some people who were saying, well, here are some resources, and, kind of thinking out loud, here are some things that I'm thinking about doing, some essential questions that I'm thinking about asking my students in class. Um, and then at the other end, you would have teachers who would say, I don't think I'm going to do this. I don't want to create a political space within my classroom.
Hmm.
Um, I, even though I think language learning, I think everything is political. Let's just go ahead and put that
Uh-huh.
out there.
Okay.
That's
We'll come back to that. Quite,
the
you
moral.
better believe
Yeah.
it, LJ. But go ahead. Yeah.
uh, and I think that happens a lot. And we miss so much of who our students are and opportunities for us to engage with our students when we don't bring these issues into the classroom, and we don't allow students to sort of unpack these things within an academic space and within communities that may be different from the communities that they experience when they go back to their homes. And so I, I just think that's so important. And kind of the moral of the story, what I always tell people is that, you know, when you tackle these types of issues, it's supposed to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And to just kind of welcome that discomfort and to embrace it, actually, and to let our students know that they will experience that discomfort as well, and that's okay, that's part of the process. And so I don't think that should be something that deters people from wanting to have these so-called political conversations in the classroom. And I think a lot of times when we use the term political, what we really mean is partisan. And
Mm.
I don't think these types of discussions have to be related to partisanship, like political parties, because no matter what your political identification is or affiliation is, within that identity, we would hope that people still value critical thinking and self transformation, and just growth, and just a commitment to learning more about other communities, and learning how we can be more empathetic to others with whom we interact. And I think that's just so needed in our society today. I think if we had more of those difficult conversations at the low stakes level, we would avoid some of the escalation to these high stakes events that we've seen.
Low stakes and preparation and it being more of a habit, being more programmatic even. You have as an essential question for us as we start our conversation, what is the role of critical social justice oriented pedagogies in the language classroom, which along with your teacher education background and everything you've been talking about touching on the political nature of our lives by definition, it's like setting up an opportunity to have an ongoing foundation for such discussions.
Mhm.
How do you do that?
That's a good question, and that's something that I believe I have struggled with at times. I'm going to share an example of that. A couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years at this point, I did my first study abroad experience at the university level. As a high school teacher, I've done study abroad to several places: Mexico, Spain. Um, And at the high school level, I mean, at the college level, I developed this program to the Dominican Republic with another colleague of mine. And that first year, I ended up being the faculty member to take the students and to develop the classes. And I was so excited to have that program happen in the Dominican Republic because it's just such a racially diverse place. It's linguistically diverse.
Mm.
And it so many opportunities when you talk to people and when you really look at the history and the culture, to be able to make parallels to our own experiences in our communities in North Carolina. Most of my students were from the state of North Carolina,
Mhm.
and the first time that I did that, I felt like it wasn't as successful as I wanted it to be because the relationships weren't there among the students.
Interesting.
They didn't know each other well. And so, whenever we would have these types of conversations that require a high level of emotional investment,
Mhm.
um, I felt like the students held back a little and that they were nervous and they felt on the spot. Uh, and and so that reminded me that I needed to have what you mentioned earlier, and when you repeated what I said about low stakes conversations, I needed to incorporate more of those low stakes community building
Mhm.
experiences, not just at the beginning when you're doing those icebreakers and you get to know each other, but that needs to happen throughout the entire course. And I think that experience, just because it was so short, it was 3 weeks, and it was a three week program. It just reminded me, wow, without those experiences, without those relationships, without that level of trust, um, there won't be a lot of vulnerability.
Mhm.
And if you really want students to invest in the conversation, they really have to have relationships. And so, what does that look like now? Right now, again, talking about meeting the moment, all of my classes are online asynchronous. So, how in the
Oh
world do I
my.
develop
Yeah.
those? How do I foster those types of relationships that are needed in order to have these types of conversations in my current classes? And one practical thing that I do is, two actually, the first practical thing is, having those community building, low stakes conversations and experiences where you learn a little bit about each other, but you're not really in a space where you're thinking about where you're having to critically challenge the way that you think, or critically examine the way other people think. Having a lot of those experiences throughout the course,
Mhm.
and then also having the students work in small groups, consistent small groups throughout the semester. And I found that to be effective. In my current class, for example, last semester I taught a third semester Spanish course. So, most students on the intermediate, low, some novice, high proficiency level.
Mhm.
Um, and throughout that entire semester, they worked in the same group of about 7 to 8 students. I had about maybe among the two between the two sections that I had, probably about 45 students, but they all worked in small groups throughout the entire semester in order to build those relationships.
Okay.
Because otherwise, if we're having discussion boards and voice threads and all these kinds of things, if I didn't do that, students could go through the whole semester having only one or two conversations with their classmates,
Uh-huh.
just because they have so many options. And if you, when you're at a discussion board, you're looking at comments from 40 other different students. It's hard to really build a relationship there, and it's hard to grow together, and it's hard to really see not only your own transformation and your own growth, but that of other students as well, and to really be able to engage with them. So that's just something practical that I do. I think a lot of social justice work is theoretical, but I also I think it's important to speak very concretely about how this looks in the classroom. I always say that it's about the philosophy and not the practices, but at the same time, I do realize that it's not helpful to just talk about ideas without thinking about, well, what does this look like in my own context?
When you see an event such as we have experienced here this week, when you come across concepts which can remain abstract, how do you insert that in then into the community that you have built through the division of these young people in these groups?
So I'm going to take a step back.
Okay.
And as you mentioned earlier, I'm in Wilmington, North Carolina. And this was the place of the 1898 Wilmington race riots, the coup d'etat in Wilmington, um, against the Black population.
Yeah.
And I'm from Wilmington. I went to schools in this area. I didn't go to school in Wilmington because by the time I was like in middle school and high school, I was living in a small town that was right outside of Wilmington called Regalwood. But I didn't learn about the Wilmington race riots until I was teaching high school
Mm,
in Chapel Hill. So
interesting.
this would have been after my undergraduate and my master's degree. And I just thought it was interesting because moving back here and seeing Wilmington through the eyes of an adult versus through the eyes of a child and adolescent, I just thought, wow, how much more would I have understood about the context of where I lived, some of my own experiences
Mm,
with racism. How much more would I have been able to understand and unpack that if I was able to examine this when I was during my K through 12 schooling.
indeed.
Um, and so I think about that perspective now as I'm teaching my own students. I'm always thinking about what's going on in our own neighborhoods, our own communities. What am I thinking about? What are our students thinking about? And how can I incorporate that into the classroom in a way that promotes their language proficiency, in a way that supports their development in the language, right? I'm not
Hmm.
saying that you completely abandon the language learning aspect of the class in order to discuss these issues. I think that they are inextricably linked, and I think that the language curriculum allows space for these types of issues to be incorporated into the curriculum. Um, Part of our 5 C's of the curriculum that we teach, the standards, the actual standards, are communities and cultures,
Hmm.
and
Yes, indeed.
so there is space to incorporate that into the curriculum. And so um, what I do is I try to build essential questions that allow for opportunities and experiences like this to happen in the language classroom. So when I'm thinking about um, for example, I'll give you an example. So first unit of my third semester Spanish class, students are learning to describe themselves and others using some advanced adjectives. They're learning to they're building their proficiency with narrating and talking about the present tense. And so my essential question is, how do we construct and perform our individual and social identities? And
Ah,
so within that unit, we look at intersectionality of identities. We look at racial justice. We look at daily activism and allyship. And And those are sort of the themes and the context that I use. And within that, students are using the language functions, the grammar and vocabulary that they would have otherwise been using anyway. They're still using the present tense. They're still using these adjectives and other language structures in order to describe themselves, to describe others, to describe institutions, that kind of thing. And so I try to, at the lesson planning, unit planning, course development level, think about what are some essential questions that would allow me to discuss and incorporate some of these critical topics in a seamless way within the curriculum. And then I try to find resources that reflect that. I'm very intentional about selecting resources from marginalized communities, from minoritized communities,
Hmm.
communities that have been made, that have traditionally been thought of as being minorities.
Uh-huh.
Even though looking at it in a global perspective, they're not minorities
Yeah.
numbers wise, right?
This society
It's
maybe,
a
but not
power.
globally, right?
Right, yeah. So it's about power more than about concrete numbers. And through that, I have found that, and I think other teachers will find that their students, in many cases, have been thinking about these things before they came to the classroom,
Interesting.
and they've already been engaged in these types of things, and so it's just so exciting to see that happen. Like I've had students who have shared artistic productions with me, like poetry or music or art that they had composed, and then I can incorporate that into the classroom, and so it's just really exciting. And um, again, I think we have to think about what works best within our own context, within our own communities. And in my community, there is a large population of Spanish speaking people. And so I like to think of Spanish as a community language, not a foreign language, not even a world language. It's a language that is very vibrant and visible within our own communities and within the experience of the students that are in my classroom. And so if anything, there is an intersection of communities, but there aren't these sort of distinct us versus them type communities. So I'm looking at how our communities overlap and how we interpret the same situation, the same experiences differently, based on our own identities and our own perspectives, even though we are within the same community.
Indeed, and fascinating because I'm thinking about it was looking at some of your resources include the intercultural reflection tools, and so many folks have talked about within the classroom, although I'm also going to ask you to extrapolate it into the society, okay, in just a minute. So, fair
Mhm.
warning, okay, that the folks don't know that they have a culture. They come at things from their own identity and their own experience unless they're exposed to and can be allowed to explore and understand how to explore other languages and cultures, other identities. And so when you are working with what you have in this in the classroom in this case, bringing that into being, making sure that people understand that they are coming from different perspectives, correct?
Mhm.
And how do you continue to help students? And again, I warned you, extrapolate into the real world too, real world, the world beyond the classroom. About how
Right.
would then folks that are outside think in the terms of the ways that you do inside a course? What are some of the keys to helping others to experience, learn, and grow in the way that you're helping your students to do so?
So when you say others, you're talking about people who are community members who may not be students.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Um, so something that you said early in that question was how a lot of students may feel like they don't have a culture when they are in our classes. And it reminds me of a study I did. This was back when I was teaching high school. Um, for the listeners, I taught high school as a Spanish teacher and an English to speakers of other languages teacher for about 10 years before going to the university. And in my Spanish class, I invited a scholar to come and talk about some issues that were relevant to Puerto Rican culture from his perspective. And so he came and talked about some issues that were affecting people who were Puerto Rican. And one question that we asked students was, what do you think about your own culture? What does this help you realize about your own culture by looking at these experiences and talking about the experience of certain Puerto Ricans? And one thing I noticed was for a lot of my white students in particular, they were the ones saying, well, I never really thought of myself as having a culture. And I think that goes back to this normalization of whiteness that we see in our curricula and in a lot of our resources, where it's like whiteness is just presented as the norm.
Hmm.
English speaking is sort of presented as the norm.
Hmm.
And other experiences outside of that, those are seen as, sort of quote unquote culture, the culture of these people who are different. But a lot of times, if we're part of a dominant culture, um, we don't see that element of dominant culture as being culture in and of itself,
Right.
just because we're used to it being the norm. And so, yeah, I think that's something that is important to unpack. And in my own classes, we do a lot of reflecting where we critically examine, why do we feel this way? Um, what experiences have I had that would bring me to this perspective? I do a lot of that in my classes. And for language teachers out there, that's a great way for students to engage with using past tense in your language. And in Spanish, you have the preterite and imperfect. And so we do a lot of reflection activities where students think about their past experiences, and not in the sense of, tell me about a party that you once had, but tell me
Yeah.
about an experience that you had and how that experience may affect the perspective that you bring to this particular issue. So again, they're still using the same vocabulary, same structures that they would be if they were discussing something rather superficial. Um, and so just creating opportunities for that to happen. And and going back to the other part of your question about how that relates to the world outside of the classroom, I think it goes back to the way that we frame questions. I read your piece that came out today about words matter. Um, and it just made me think about it is so important to be direct and to be specific with the language that we're using, especially as language educators and language students. And one thing that I like to do with my students is when we look at something and we compare and we talk about different perspectives, I never put a marginalized perspective up for debate. I never say, do you agree or disagree with this person's opinion? Um,
Interesting.
because in a way that just puts their humanity up for debate in the classroom, and I don't want to do that. I've been in that situation where that's been done to
Ah,
me, and
wow.
and I know that for a lot of our students, they also have been in that situation, and I think that's a skill that's important for them to have. As they leave the classroom and they engage in social media or wherever with these types of conversations. So instead of, do you agree or do you disagree with this topic, we look at the perspective that the person brings and we say, okay, what experiences has this person had that led them to this perspective? right?
Okay.
How might we unpack and critically examine this perspective a little bit? Because also, I think, no offense, I've been there before, I've done it, but I think it's kind of lazy to say, "Do you agree?" That's such a lazy question,
It
right?
is. It is.
So,
And you're right, it normalizes where they're coming from and puts the other up for judgment. That's
yeah,
that's truly fascinating. And that is a technique which can use the language if you're talking about growing a
right.
language skill, but it also
Hmm.
provides a brand new skill to take out there in the big wide world.
Exactly.
How successful is it for students? Do they you help them to perceive what it is that you are doing with that regard in that regard too, correct?
Yes.
Do you ever have
Yeah,
pushback?
I try to. Oh, can you say that again?
Yes, do you ever have pushback?
Of course. Um, and I think I'm used to that though. Um, uh, so a little bit more about my context. I am at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I love working here. I love the community. Obviously, I have strong ties to this community because I'm from here. However, the abbreviation for the university is UNCW, for the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, but people joke and call it UNC White. They say that the W
Interesting.
stands for white because it's not a super diverse place, and even racially, at least. And even looking at my class roster for the current semester, just looking at the faces, all of my students this current semester are either white or white passing at least. And so um, a lot of times I am the only black person in the classroom. And I have been in situations where I've gotten pushback and I've been accused of promoting a particular agenda. For a lot of students, I'll be the only black professor that they have. Um,
Interesting.
I had a student recently who was a senior and he was black. And at the end of the semester, he told me, I've never been in a class where I felt like my experience was just part of the class itself. Like it wasn't a special unit about black people, but it's just
Ah,
we were embedded and normalized throughout the course. And he said, I never had that experience before and never actually had a black professor before. And, this was a senior capstone class. He was graduating that semester
wow.
and he went through his whole college experience without having a black professor. Um, and yeah, so I do get that pushback every now and then. And one thing that I've done recently that has helped with that is in my syllabus, I tell students, this language class may be a little bit different from other classes that you've had. I tell them that I try to take a social justice oriented, critical approach to the study of language. And I explain to them from my perspective what I think that means and how that might look in our classes. Um, and and then going back to what I was talking about earlier about feeling uncomfortable, um, maybe addressing topics that they're not used to addressing in the language classroom. I explain
Mhm.
that we're going to do a little bit of that in the class and that's okay. It's to be expected. And we're all on this transformative journey together. I tell them how excited I am to be able to learn from them and to be able to grow with them. Don't I, as Freire would say, I try to resist the banking model of education. I don't view myself as the expert who's filling students with information, but it's a dialogue, and I feel like my students and we grow together as we experience the class and as we learn from one another, and as we all share our experiences. So,
That's brilliant.
yeah,
That's brilliant. And again, being comfortable with discomfort, knowing that it's temporary on behalf of an important aim.
I did want to mention one other thing
Yes.
that I think is important and that I also incorporate into my sort of beginning of the year speech or declaration is I remind students that we cannot change these social issues within my class, that we will not experience closure. Um, I think if you go into these conversations, like for example, today, if teachers go into their classroom thinking, okay, we're going to have this conversation and we're all going to leave completely transformed and ready to change the world, that's not going to happen. And it's
Mhm.
actually going to be very frustrating if your students expect that.
Yeah.
And so just make sure that we tailor our expectations to to what's realistic.
Thank you very much for adding that. And I'm sure that everyone listening will be like, thank you for that realistic sense too. LJ, I want you to do one more thing here. I always ask
Sure.
my podcast guests to turn uh, emotionally, as it were, towards those that are listening and to provide them one last, what, invitation, exhortation, warning, whatever, however you would like to interpret that. Turn to our audience and what do you want to make sure that they leave with today?
Um, ultimately, that this is a starting point. You know, when I began this conversation with you, I wasn't exactly sure where it would go, and I feel like we've been talking for a while, and we're already at the end of the conversation, and we barely even scratched the surface of what I thought this conversation might entail. And so just the fact that this is a journey, and to take small steps. um, the idea here is social justice in language education, and I want to make sure that I define what I believe social justice is, because I think that's important. And again, I'm not an expert. I This is all very subjective, and I recognize that. So I'm not framing myself to be the expert, but it's important to understand my perspective so that you'll just know how to interpret what I'm saying. But I believe social justice is sort of the equitable distribution of benefits, tangible and intangible resources, and ultimately power in a society. So I think social justice pedagogy has to do with mattering. Who matters? How do we know that this person matters in the context of what we're teaching? And yeah, it's not necessarily related to the Black Lives Matter movement, but I like that framing because I like this idea of you matter. You're valued enough to be visible, um, to be uplifted, and to be heard in the classroom. Not just you as a student, but individuals who look like you. You see them in the curriculum, and they're embedded in the experience, in the language learning experience, in a way that shows that they too are important. It's not some fringe exotic perspective that we're looking at, but it's an integral part of the course. Um, so I think that's important to keep in mind. And I also want to say again, to reiterate, that I think everything is political. Um, uh, Everything is related to power, and so it's important in our classrooms that we create space to really unpack that, because it's there anyway. There's no way that we can be neutral. There's no such thing as neutrality when it comes to this, in my opinion. Um, and I would just encourage people to, well, two things. One thing that I mentioned earlier is it's about the perspective, not the practices. So, thinking about how we ourselves are transforming, as social beings. Um, who are we engaging with online? uh, who are we engaging with within in person whenever that happens again, in our friend circles. um,
Uh-huh.
how how are we ourselves growing and engaging in society? Who are we allies for? How does that play out in our own lives, and how do we bring that to the classroom? So thinking about that for ourselves as educators, and then also thinking about how can we create experiences where our students can unpack those elements of their identity and their experiences in the same way. So what I'm trying to say is you can't just have a list of lessons and say, okay, these are social justice lessons. I'm going to go teach it and think that you're going to be able to do so in a way that's completely neutral and completely detached from your own experience. You have to embrace the personal and subjective nature of this type of work. Um, and so that's number one. And then number two, I would just say start small. Um, if I had my way,
Uh-huh.
we would, you know, just scratch all the destroy all institutions and build them from the ground up in a way that's equitable. But I know that's not the case, and so what we have are, as a result, are a bunch of inequitable institutions, and so it's not something, as I mentioned earlier, that we can change in one discussion, in one class, one semester, one year. So just thinking about what is one small step that I can do in order to bring myself and my students closer toward that ultimate goal of social justice and changing the world, and realizing that it is a process and that it takes time and personal transformation takes time. And so I believe that's the biggest piece that I will tell people is just to start small. Start with one lesson. You don't have to revamp your entire curriculum. Don't feel overwhelmed. Look at some of the resources that I've shared. I'm sure that Nora, you'll post these on your website. But
Absolutely.
Teaching Tolerance has some great resources that can be adapted to the language classroom. Even though I hate that term tolerance,
Hmm.
but I love their resources. I always say no one wants to hear "I tolerate you,"
Yes,
so
exactly.
that they want to hear "I appreciate you," "I celebrate you." So I find that term tolerance to be problematic, but I think they have great resources there. And then also on ACTFL with the reflection, the critical reflection, intercultural reflection framework has some great resources as well to help people link these topics to their language learning goals.
And it is, I'm so glad you have kept emphasizing throughout that this is incremental and steps. We could
Hmm.
try to start by raising, that is RAZ, raising everything to the ground and start over again. And that would be amazing, but that's not likely and probably not even advisable with the way that we go with that increment, but to go ahead and start
Right.
and take those steps. And you've provided a huge pathway today. And LJ, it has been an amazing experience to be able, and a great honor to be able to speak with you today. Thank you for sharing these concepts with us, with all of us.
Likewise, I enjoy speaking with you as well. And whoever listens to this, they can feel free to reach out to me if they have questions. I want to continue the conversation.
That's great because your resources, rich as they are, and your contact information will definitely be or is definitely on the website. It's released at the same time as this podcast. And so thank you for that invitation, LJ. And LJ, frankly, I look forward to a time to maybe continue this conversation because there are so many aspects of it that I would love to plumb more with your permission.
Great. I would love that.
All right. Thank you. Well, LJ, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends, family, and colleagues. Let's continue the conversation. Be sure to check out my website, fluencyonline.com, to learn more about our guests and to check out the resources and information they've shared with us there. I have other ideas, resources, and opportunities there for you too. Again, thanks so much for listening, and until next time,